Zane Kensington had no business being in a town this small. The moment his sleek black Aston Martin pulled to a stop on the dusty main street of Willow Creek, he felt like an outsider. The town wasn't on any map he regularly consulted, nor was it the kind of place a CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire would ever visit. But after a brutal board meeting and a PR disaster he didn't care to think about, he needed an escape just for the weekend. The plan was simple. Check into the only inn in town, keep his head down, and breathe before heading back to the chaos that was his life. He didn't expect Willow Creek to change anything. He certainly didn't expect her. Celia Monroe stepped out of the small bakery on the corner, brushing flour off her hands as she squinted at the unfamiliar car parked out front. Tourists weren't common this time of year, and certainly not ones driving cars that cost more than the entire town's yearly festival budget. She barely had time to wonder before the man himself stepped out. Tall, devastatingly handsome. Sharp blue eyes that scanned the street like he didn't belong but wasn't afraid to own it anyway. His suit, though casual, screamed money, and even the way he shut the car door had a confidence about it that made her stomach tighten. "Are you lost?" she asked, folding her arms as he approached. Zane turned, brows lifting at the woman before him. She was stunning in a way that wasn't manufactured. Wild chestnut hair pulled into a loose ponytail, bright brown eyes filled with amusement, and a dusting of flour on her cheek that made her look effortlessly beautiful. "For once I might be," he admitted, shoving his hands in his pockets. "Is there anywhere to eat around here?" Celia laughed, shaking her head. "You're standing in front of it." He glanced at the bakery sign, then back at her. "This is the only option," she gave him a pointed look. "Unless you want to drive an hour back to the city." Zane let out a breath and gestured toward the door. "Lead the way." Inside, the scent of fresh bread and warm cinnamon wrapped around him, a stark contrast to the sterile restaurants he usually dined in. Celia moved behind the counter with ease, tying an apron around her waist as she grabbed a menu. "What's good?" he asked, scanning the handwritten options. "Everything," she grinned. "But if you want something that'll change your life, go for the peach cobbler." Zane arched a brow. "That's a bold claim." Celia leaned forward, resting her elbows on the counter. "Are you afraid to take a risk, city boy?" Something about her teasing tone made his pulse kick up a notch. He wasn't used to people challenging him not like this. In boardrooms, people feared him. They catered to him, but Celia, she had no idea who he was, and that was oddly refreshing. "Fine," he said, leaning closer. "Impress me." Minutes later, he took his first bite of the cobbler, and the moment the warm, spiced peaches hit his tongue, he let out an involuntary groan. Celia smirked. "Told you." He shook his head, setting his fork down. "Okay, that was ridiculous." She shot him a satisfied look before wiping her hands on a towel. "So, what brings you to our little town?" "Business?" Zane hesitated. He could tell her the truth that he was the CEO of Kensington Enterprises, a company that had its hands in everything from luxury real estate to tech. But something about this place, about her, made him want to be just Zane for a little while. Just passing through. Celia narrowed her eyes, clearly not buying it, but she didn't push. "Well, welcome to Willow Creek. Try not to get bored." Something told him that wouldn't be a problem. The next morning, Zane found himself walking the quiet streets, coffee in hand. Willow Creek was nothing like the world he knew. No skyscrapers, no luxury cars, no cutthroat meetings. Just friendly faces, slow mornings, and a bakery that smelled like heaven. And Celia. He hadn't stopped thinking about her since yesterday. The way she teased him, the way she moved with effortless confidence, it was dangerous how drawn he was to her. "You're still here," Celia's voice called from behind him. He turned to see her standing in front of the bakery, apron already tied around her waist. "Didn't have anywhere better to be," he admitted. She studied him for a moment before nodding toward the shop. "Come on in, I could use some help." Zane lifted a brow. You want me to work, she shrugged. Unless you have a better offer, he didn't. For the next few hours, Zane found himself doing things he'd never done before: kneading dough, dusting flour off countertops, even taking orders. It was ridiculous. It was messy. And for the first time in years, he felt free. You're terrible at this, Celia said, laughing as he struggled to roll out dough. Zane smirked. I run a billion-dollar company. I think I can handle. The dough ripped in half. Celia burst out laughing. Something inside him shifted at the sound. He'd been around beautiful women before: models, socialites, heiresses. But none of them had ever made him feel like this. By the time the afternoon sun dipped lower, Zane realized something unsettling. He was enjoying himself. Too much. He was supposed to leave tomorrow. That was the plan. But as Celia wiped flour off his face, her fingers lingering just a second too long, he wondered if one more day would hurt. Or maybe two. Celia tilted her head, eyes scanning his face. What? Zane shook his head, a slow smile curving his lips. Nothing, he said. Just thinking. About how this weekend was supposed to be temporary, and how, suddenly, he wished it wasn't. Zane had never stayed in one place without a schedule, without an agenda. Yet here he was, waking up in a bed that wasn't his, in a town that wasn't even on his radar a few days ago. The sun streamed through the window of the small inn he'd checked into, the scent of fresh coffee drifting from downstairs. It was a far cry from the high-rise penthouse he was used to, but somehow it felt right. He dressed quickly, pulling on a casual button-down and rolling up the sleeves. He had no meetings, no calls, no pressing deadlines. For the first time in years, his day was wide open, and he knew exactly where he was going. The bell above the bakery door jingled as he stepped inside, and Celia glanced up from behind the counter, her face lighting up with something close to amusement. You're back, she said, tying her apron tighter around her waist. Zane leaned against the counter, arching a brow. You sound surprised. Most visitors don't come back twice. Especially not ones who look like they belong in a boardroom instead of a bakery. There it was again, that teasing, easy confidence that made her so different from the women in his world. There was no pretense with her, no hidden agenda. Just Celia standing in the warm glow of the bakery, flour dusting her arms, her expression playful yet guarded. He glanced at the display case, the golden pastries arranged neatly behind the glass. I figured I should give you a chance to redeem yourself after yesterday's disaster. Celia let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. You mean your disaster? I have never seen someone struggle so much with a rolling pin. Zane exhaled a laugh, a rare thing these days. I was distracted. By what? His gaze held hers, something unspoken passing between them. Celia's smile faltered just slightly, her fingers tightening around the rag she was using to wipe the counter. Before she could respond, the door swung open and a woman bustled in, a toddler balanced on her hip. She greeted Celia warmly, placing an order while the little girl reached eagerly for the cookies in the glass case. Celia leaned down, handing the child a small sugar cookie without hesitation. Zane watched the exchange, something stirring in his chest. The way Celia interacted with the people here, the way she knew them by name, by habit, it was something he couldn't quite place. Something he didn't have. When the customer left, Celia turned back to him, tilting her head slightly. So, what's the real reason you're still here? Zane hesitated. He could have given her a dozen answers, that he needed a break, that the city had become suffocating, that for once he wanted to exist outside of being Zane Kensington, CEO. But instead he found himself saying, I'm not sure yet. Celia studied him for a moment before tossing the rag onto the counter. Well, if you're planning on lingering, you might as well make yourself useful. He exhaled a breath, shaking his head. You're really putting me to work again. You need the practice, she teased, walking toward the back. Come on. And just like that, he found himself in the kitchen again, this time attempting something far more delicate than rolling out dough. Celia handed him a piping bag filled with frosting, demonstrating how to decorate a tray of cupcakes. Zane concentrated, attempting to replicate her smooth, effortless swirls. The result was disastrous. Celia glanced at his attempt and bit her lip, clearly holding back laughter. That's impressive. Don't lie. Fine, she grinned. It's terrible. Zane huffed a laugh, setting the piping bag down. I don't get it. I run one of the most successful companies in the country, and yet I can't decorate a cupcake to save my life. Celia leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. Maybe that's the problem. He frowned slightly. What do you mean? You've spent your whole life perfecting one thing, your business. Maybe you just never gave yourself the chance to be bad at something. The words hit deeper than he expected. He had spent his entire life chasing perfection, believing that failure wasn't an option. But here, in this tiny kitchen, with Celia watching him with amusement and something softer beneath it, he realized that maybe failure wasn't the end of the world. Maybe, for once, it was okay to just be. A comfortable silence settled between them as Celia moved to box up an order. Zane found himself watching her, the way she moved with quiet confidence, the way she hummed under her breath as she worked. You love this place, he said, more of an observation than a question. Celia paused, glancing at him. Of course I do, it's home. He nodded slowly. Home. It was such a foreign concept to him. His penthouse in the city was expensive, luxurious, but it wasn't home. It was just another space he occupied. Celia wiped her hands on a towel and turned to him, her expression curious. What about you? Where's home for you? Zane opened his mouth, but no answer came. He had properties all over the world, yet none of them felt like the word she was asking for. Celia must have noticed his hesitation because she smiled softly. That's what I thought. Before he could respond, the door to the bakery opened again, this time with an older man stepping inside. He greeted Celia warmly before turning his attention to Zane. You're the new face in town, the man said, extending a hand. Name's Walter. I own the hardware store down the street. Zane shook his hand, noting the firm grip. Zane. Walter's eyes twinkled with curiosity. City boy, huh? What brings you here? Zane glanced at Celia, then back at Walter. I needed a change of scenery. Walter chuckled. Well, you picked a good place for it. Just be careful, this town has a way of making people want to stay longer than they planned. Zane felt Celia's eyes on him, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he wondered if that wasn't already happening. Later that evening, as he walked back to the inn, he found himself lingering outside the bakery, watching as Celia locked up for the night. She glanced up, meeting his gaze through the dimming light. Still not sure why you're here, she asked, her voice quieter now, more thoughtful. Zane took a slow breath before shaking his head. No, but I think I'm starting to figure it out. Celia held his gaze for a moment before offering a small smile. Good night, Zane. He watched her walk away, something shifting deep in his chest. This was supposed to be a weekend escape. And yet, with every passing hour, the idea of leaving felt less and less possible. Zane had convinced himself that one more day wouldn't make a difference. That staying just a little longer in Willow Creek was harmless. But as the days blurred together, he stopped keeping track of how many times he told himself he'd leave tomorrow. Tomorrow never came. Instead, he found himself drawn deeper into the town's quiet rhythm. Mornings at the bakery, afternoons spent wandering streets he had learned by heart, evenings where the air smelled like warm earth and wood smoke from distant fireplaces. It was a world apart from the one he had built for himself, a world he was beginning to realize he might not want to leave. But it wasn't just the town. Celia had slipped into his thoughts in ways he hadn't expected. She challenged him. She made him laugh when he wasn't supposed to. She looked at him like he was just a man, not a billionaire whose name carried weight in boardrooms across the country. And that, more than anything, made her dangerous. Late one afternoon, he found himself back at the bakery, watching as Celia worked behind the counter. It was quieter than usual, the usual rush of customers having come and gone. She was focused, kneading dough with sleeves rolled up past her elbows, her brow furrowed in concentration. She hadn't noticed him yet. Zane leaned on the counter, taking in the way a strand of hair had slipped from her ponytail, the way she pressed her lip between her teeth as she worked. He had never been the type to observe, to simply exist in a moment without thinking 3 steps ahead. Yet here, with her, he found himself doing exactly that. Celia finally glanced up, her expression shifting when she saw him. "You again," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "You sound disappointed." She let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "Not disappointed. Just wondering how long you plan on pretending you're just passing through." Zane hesitated, not expecting the question to cut as deep as it did. "What makes you think I'm pretending?" Celia studied him for a moment before shrugging. "People who are just passing through don't learn how to make sourdough starter." He exhaled a breath, shaking his head. "That was one time. And yet you're still here." He had no response to that. Celia wiped the last of the flour from her hands before leaning against the counter. "So, what's keeping you?" Zane could have said anything, that he was enjoying the break. That he wasn't ready to go back. That the city could survive without him for a little longer, but none of it would have been the truth. Instead, he let silence stretch between them, waiting to see if she would push for an answer. She didn't. Instead, she reached for a tray of pastries, carefully arranging them in the glass case. "Walter's been asking about you," she said, changing the subject. "He thinks you might be looking for property." Zane let out a quiet laugh. "That man is relentless. You have no idea. He already has a list of places he thinks you should see." Zane shook his head, amused. "Tell him not to get any ideas. I'm not looking to buy a house." Celia arched a brow. "No," he hesitated. She didn't press, but the doubt in her expression was enough to make something shift in his chest. Before he could say anything, the bakery door swung open, and a familiar voice filled the space. "There you are." Zane turned, his entire body tensing at the sight of the man standing in the doorway. Jason Langley. His right-hand man, his closest advisor, the one person who had been with him through every business deal, every impossible decision. And he did not look happy. Jason strode inside, his sharp gaze sweeping over the bakery before landing on Zane. "I've been trying to reach you for days. Your assistant said you were taking time off, but I didn't think that meant disappearing completely." Zane exhaled slowly, running a hand over his jaw. He had known this moment would come eventually. He just hadn't expected it to happen here, in the middle of a bakery with Celia standing mere feet away. Jason glanced at her, then back at Zane. "We need to talk." Celia, to her credit, didn't pry. She simply gave Zane a look, one that told him she knew this was the moment he had been avoiding, before stepping away to give them space. Jason wasted no time, lowering his voice as he spoke. "The board is getting restless. There's a deal in Singapore that needs your approval, and investors are starting to ask questions." "You can't just disappear, Zane, not without warning." Zane leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "I needed time." "Time?" Jason's expression hardened. "Since when do you take time?" "Since now, since Celia. Since this town that had made him question everything he thought he wanted." Jason ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "Look, I get it. You needed a break. Fine, but this isn't you. You don't just walk away from deals. You don't ignore the company you built." Zane glanced at Celia, who was pretending not to listen but was failing miserably. Jason followed his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Is this about her?" Zane didn't answer. Jason let out a slow breath. You have to decide, Zane. Whatever this is, whatever you're doing here, it's not permanent, it's not real. Zane felt something tighten in his chest. Jason continued, his voice softer now. I know you. You don't stay in one place, you don't build roots, and you sure as hell don't let distractions get in the way of business. Zane clenched his jaw. Jason sighed. I'll be at the inn. Think about what you're doing. With that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving Zane standing in the silence that followed. Celia glanced at him, her expression unreadable. And for the first time since he had arrived in Willow Creek, the weight of reality crashed down on him. He had been pretending that this life, this town, this feeling was something he could keep. But Jason was right, it wasn't real. And sooner or later he would have to leave. Zane had always been good at making decisions. Calculated, strategic, necessary decisions that shaped the empire he had built from the ground up. There was no room for hesitation, no space for doubt. But standing outside the bakery, watching Celia move through the quiet space, he felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before: uncertainty. Jason's words had rattled something deep inside him, shaking the foundation of the carefully constructed world he had lived in for so long. His life had always been about power, control, and forward momentum. He never stopped, he never lingered, and yet here he was, still here. Celia had noticed the shift in him the moment Jason walked out the door. She wasn't the type to eavesdrop, but she didn't have to. The tension in Zane's posture, the way his jaw had tightened, the way his gaze had darkened with something unreadable, it told her everything. She wiped her hands on her apron slowly, choosing her words carefully. So, you're leaving? It wasn't a question. Zane exhaled, rubbing a hand across his jaw. I don't know. Celia studied him for a long moment before nodding. Right. He didn't like the way she said it, like she had already made up her mind about him. Like she had already decided how this was going to end. The silence between them stretched, heavy with the weight of unspoken things. Zane had never been one for hesitation, but this whatever this was had him second-guessing everything. Finally, Celia untied her apron and set it aside. I should close up. Something about the finality in her voice made his chest tighten. He wanted to say something, anything, but no words came. He had faced impossible negotiations, ruthless competitors, and high-stakes decisions that could make or break entire industries. But he had never faced this. He had never faced the possibility of wanting something he couldn't have. Celia moved toward the door, flipping the sign to closed before turning back to him. You don't have to explain, Zane. But that was the problem. He wanted to. He wanted her to understand that what he felt for her, for this town, for this life he had glimpsed, wasn't fleeting. It wasn't something he could just walk away from without consequence. But he had spent his entire life convincing himself that love, real love, was something that didn't fit into the world he had built. And now, standing in front of the woman who had made him question everything, he found himself at a crossroads he had never prepared for. Celia let out a quiet breath, her expression steady but guarded. I knew what this was. Zane's gaze locked onto hers, something sharp and desperate flickering beneath the surface. Celia, she shook her head. Don't. But he couldn't stop now. He couldn't leave it like this. He took a step closer, closing the space between them. You don't know what this is. Celia held his gaze, her breath hitching slightly, but she didn't step back. Then tell me. Zane had never been a man who struggled for words. But standing in front of her, he realized that no carefully crafted sentence could capture what was happening inside him. So he did the only thing that made sense. He kissed her. It wasn't careful. It wasn't hesitant. It was raw, desperate, filled with every unanswered question and every unspoken want. Celia's fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, holding onto him like she wasn't sure she wanted to let go. And maybe that was the problem. Maybe neither of them knew how to walk away from this now. When they finally pulled apart, her lips were slightly swollen, her gaze searching his. "What do you want, Zane?" The question hit him harder than he expected. What did he want? For the first time in his life, the answer wasn't money or power or another high-stakes deal. It was her. It was this town that had settled into his bones in a way he couldn't shake. It was a life he had never let himself dream of. But he also knew that staying meant unraveling everything he had spent years building. Celia must have seen the war in his expression, because she took a small step back, her voice softer now. "You don't have to decide right now." But he did, because if he walked away now, he knew he wouldn't come back. And that thought, the idea of never seeing her again, of never stepping foot in this town again, was unbearable. He took a steady breath, his hand reaching for hers, fingers brushing against her skin. "Celia, if I stay?" She waited, her eyes locked onto his. "I don't know what that looks like," he admitted. "I don't know how to do this." Her lips parted slightly, her expression unreadable. "Then we figure it out." Zane had spent his entire life planning out every move, every decision, but for the first time he wanted to take a risk without knowing the outcome. He wanted to stay. Not for a weekend, not as an escape, but because he had finally found something worth slowing down for. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers. Zane had always been a man of action. When he made a choice, he followed through. There were no second guesses, no hesitation, but this was different. Choosing to stay in Willow Creek wasn't just a decision. It was a risk, one that didn't come with projections or guarantees. It was a gamble on something he had never allowed himself to want. Celia watched him carefully, her fingers still laced with his. There was something in her eyes, hope maybe, but guarded. Like she was afraid to believe him, afraid that this moment would collapse like a house of cards. He couldn't blame her. The bakery was quiet around them, the scent of cinnamon and warm dough lingering in the air. The world outside was dark, the streetlights casting a soft glow through the windows. It felt like they existed in a space separate from everything else, a quiet pocket of time where nothing beyond this moment mattered. "I don't want to make promises I can't keep," Zane said, his voice steady, "but I know I don't want to walk away from this." Celia studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then don't." It was simple. No ultimatums, no demands, just an openness he wasn't used to. She didn't ask him to stay forever. She didn't ask him to change who he was. She simply gave him the space to figure it out, to choose for himself, and that was what made it real. A knock at the bakery door startled them both. Zane turned, his pulse tightening when he saw Jason standing outside, his expression unreadable. Celia gave his hand a small squeeze before stepping away, giving them space. Zane exhaled before unlocking the door, letting Jason inside. His advisor took a step in, glancing around the bakery before focusing on Zane. "I wasn't sure if you'd still be here." Zane crossed his arms. "I am." Jason nodded slowly. "I figured." There was no judgment in his tone, no sharp edge to his words, just quiet understanding. Zane waited for him to launch into another speech about responsibilities and obligations, but Jason simply let out a breath. "The board is expecting you back," he said. "But I already told them you'd need time." Zane frowned slightly. "You did," Jason gave him a look. "I've known you long enough to know when your mind is somewhere else." Zane didn't respond. Jason ran a hand through his hair before continuing. "I'm not going to tell you what to do. But you need to ask yourself if this is something you're willing to fight for." Zane glanced toward Celia, who was pretending not to listen from behind the counter. Jason followed his gaze and sighed. "If it is, then figure out how to make it work. You're not a man who walks away from what he wants." It was true. Zane had fought for everything in his life, his company, his success, his reputation. Why should this be any different? Jason clapped a hand on his shoulder. "I'll handle things on my end." But don't take too long to decide." With that, he left, the door closing softly behind him. Zane stood there for a moment, the only sound between them the faint hum of the ovens cooling. Celia wiped her hands on a towel before leaning against the counter. "You don't owe me anything, Zane." He turned to face her. "That's not the point." She gave him a small, knowing look. "Then what is?" He took a slow breath. "I've spent my whole life chasing something, building something. But when I look at you when I'm here, I don't feel like I have to keep running." Celia's lips parted slightly, her expression softer now. "I don't know what comes next," he admitted. "But I know I want to figure it out with you." Celia didn't say anything right away. Instead, she stepped closer, her hands resting lightly against his chest. "You don't have to have all the answers," she murmured. Zane's fingers brushed against her cheek, tilting her face up toward his. "That's new for me." She smiled, and for the first time in a long time, Zane felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The next morning, when he woke up in the inn, he didn't think about boardrooms or stock projections. He thought about the bakery. He thought about Celia. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he was losing something by staying. He felt like he was finally gaining something worth holding on to. The morning sun cast long, golden streaks through the windows of the bakery, illuminating the flour-dusted countertops and baskets filled with fresh bread. Zane stood near the register, watching Celia move with effortless grace as she prepared the morning's pastries. It had been days since he'd made his decision to stay, yet the enormity of it still settled differently in his chest each morning. No boardrooms, no back-to-back meetings dictating his every move. Just the quiet hum of this town, the easy rhythm of life here, and Celia always Celia. She glanced over at him, her lips curving into a soft smile. "Are you going to just stand there looking important, or are you actually going to help?" Zane rolled up his sleeves, stepping toward the counter. "I thought I'd supervise." Celia handed him a tray of freshly baked croissants, her fingers brushing against his as she did. "I don't need a supervisor. I need someone who won't burn the place down." Zane chuckled, setting the tray down before reaching for a cloth to wipe the counter. It was strange how natural this felt. How easy it was to slip into this life, as though it had always been waiting for him. The doorbell chimed as the first customer of the day stepped inside. It was Walter, the hardware store owner, carrying his usual air of quiet amusement. He gave Zane a knowing look as he approached the counter. "You're still here," Walter noted. Zane glanced at Celia, then back at Walter. "Looks like it." Walter nodded approvingly. "Good. This town could use another set of hands." Celia handed Walter his usual order, a warm loaf of sourdough wrapped in parchment paper. "If you're trying to put him to work, Walter, I already beat you to it." Walter chuckled, taking his bread before turning toward the door. "You made the right choice, son. Some things in life are worth slowing down for." Zane watched as the older man left, his words settling deep within him. Later that evening, as the bakery closed for the night, Zane and Celia lingered in the quiet space, the scent of cinnamon and sugar still thick in the air. She leaned against the counter, watching him with an unreadable expression. "You don't miss it?" she finally asked. Zane exhaled slowly, considering the question. He had spent years building his empire, chasing something that had once felt like the only thing that mattered. But standing here looking at her, he realized that his priorities had shifted in a way he never expected. "I thought I would," he admitted. "But I don't." Celia studied him, her brown eyes searching his. "What about your company?" Zane leaned against the counter beside her, his shoulder brushing against hers. "I'll figure it out. Jason is more than capable of handling things for now." She tilted her head slightly. "And if they ask you to come back," he reached for her hand, his fingers threading through hers. "Then I'll tell them I already found what I was looking for." Celia's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around his. For the first time in his life, Zane wasn't chasing something just out of reach. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He had spent years believing that love was a distraction, an inconvenience in his perfectly calculated life. But Celia wasn't a distraction. She was the reason everything made sense. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I love you, Celia." Her eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. Zane had never said those words to anyone before, never allowed himself to feel something so deeply. But with her, it wasn't a risk. It was the only truth that mattered. Celia swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around his. "You mean that?" He cupped her face, his thumb brushing over her cheek. "More than anything." A slow smile spread across her lips before she threw her arms around his neck, pulling him into a kiss that left no room for doubt. As the days passed, Zane found himself more at home in Willow Creek than he had ever felt anywhere else. He helped around the bakery, learned the names of the regulars, and found a strange comfort in the simplicity of it all. One evening, as they walked through the quiet streets, Zane suddenly pulled Celia to a stop beneath the soft glow of the streetlights. She looked at him curiously, but before she could say anything, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Celia's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. Zane opened the box, revealing a stunning diamond ring set in delicate gold. His voice was steady, certain. "I never expected to find this to find you. But now that I have, I don't want to spend another moment without you. Marry me, Celia." Tears welled in her eyes as she covered her mouth with her hands. He held his breath, waiting. Finally, she let out a shaky laugh, nodding as she threw herself into his arms. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." Zane slipped the ring onto her finger before kissing her deeply, sealing the promise between them. Months later, the entire town gathered in the small chapel at the edge of Willow Creek to celebrate their wedding. The air buzzed with laughter, the scent of fresh flowers filling the space. As Celia walked down the aisle in a simple yet breathtaking white gown, Zane felt his chest tighten with something he had never known before: pure, unfiltered happiness. When she reached him, he took her hands in his thumb brushing over her wedding band. "I never thought I'd find a place where I belonged," he whispered. Celia smiled up at him, her eyes shining. "You did." As they exchanged vows, as they promised forever, Zane knew with absolute certainty that this was the best decision he had ever made. Not the billion-dollar deals, not the skyscrapers with his name on them, but this, their life together. As he kissed his wife, as the town erupted into cheers, he knew without a doubt he was finally home.